I was 12 years old when my mother looked me straight in the eyes and made me promise something that, at the time, felt almost absurd. She placed an old wooden sewing box on the kitchen table, rested both hands on it, and said quietly, "No matter what happens to me, never open this box. Not after she died. Not if you became curious. Not even if someone told you there was something valuable inside." I laughed. To me, it was just an old sewing box filled with needles, thread, and buttons. I promised without thinking. 30 years later, I was standing alone in my childhood home, holding that same dusty box in my hands. My mother had been gone for decades. The house was about to be sold. And for the first time in my life, I seriously considered breaking the only promise I had ever made to her. I thought I was about to find old sewing supplies. Instead, I uncovered a truth that changed everything I believed about my family and about the woman I thought I knew. Some childhood memories fade with time. Faces become blurry. Voices disappear. Entire summers vanish from memory without leaving a single trace. But there are certain moments that remain untouched, no matter how many decades pass. That afternoon is one of mine. It was early October of 1984. The leaves outside our little farmhouse had already begun turning shades of amber and rust, covering the narrow dirt road that led to our front porch. The air smelled like wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. Inside the house, everything felt familiar. The old grandfather clock ticked slowly in the hallway. The kettle hummed softly on the stove. A radio somewhere in the living room played gentle country music at such a low volume that it blended into the silence. My mother always loved quiet. She believed a peaceful home wasn't measured by how much laughter echoed through its walls, but by how comfortable people felt sitting together without saying a single word. She had been sewing all morning. That wasn't unusual. Nearly every piece of clothing I owned had passed through her careful hands at least once. She could mend torn jackets so perfectly that no one could ever find the tear afterward. Buttons never stayed missing for long. Even our old curtains seemed to last forever because she refused to throw anything away if it could still be repaired. She used to say something I never truly understood until I became much older. People replace things too quickly. Then she'd smile gently before adding, "Sometimes they replace people just as easily." At 12 years old, I thought she was simply talking about clothes. No, I know she wasn't. That afternoon, she called my name from the dining room. There was something different about her voice. Not fear. Not sadness. Just seriousness. The kind of seriousness children instinctively recognize without understanding why. I walked into the room expecting her to ask me to hand her a pair of scissors or thread another needle. Instead, she was sitting perfectly still. The sewing box rested on the wooden table between us. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't expensive. The varnish had faded years earlier. Tiny scratches covered every side. One brass hinge had been repaired with 2 mismatched screws. The handle leaned slightly to one side. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary old sewing box that had survived decades of everyday life. To my mother, it was something she never left unattended. She slowly placed both hands on top of it. Then she looked directly into my eyes. There was no smile, no warmth, only determination. "I need you to promise me something." Children don't usually understand the weight of promises. Adults don't either, if we're being honest. At 12 years old, a promise simply sounded like another household rule. Don't stay out after dark. Don't talk to strangers. Don't forget your homework. I nodded without thinking. "What is it?" She took a slow breath. "If anything ever happens to me." She paused for several long seconds. "Never open this sewing box." I blinked. That was it. I couldn't hide my confusion. I actually laughed. "Why?" She didn't laugh back. "Promise me." I shrugged. "Okay." She shook her head almost immediately. "No." Her voice became firmer. "I don't want you saying, 'Okay.' I want your promise." Something inside the room suddenly felt heavier. The grandfather clock continued ticking. Outside, I could hear leaves scraping across the porch in the autumn wind. Neither of us moved. I finally answered. "I promise." Only then did she close her eyes for a brief moment. It almost looked like relief. Like someone who had finally put down a burden she'd been carrying for a very long time. She reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "Thank you." I remember wanting to ask more questions. Why the sewing box? What could possibly be inside? Old needles, thread, buttons, family photographs. Nothing seemed important enough to deserve such a dramatic promise. But before I could speak again, she quietly picked up the box, held it close to her chest, and walked upstairs without another word. I watched her disappear around the corner. I had absolutely no idea that one simple promise would quietly shape the next 30 years of my life. Looking back now, I realize I spent my entire childhood believing my mother had lived a very ordinary life. She never spoke about adventures. She never told dramatic stories. She never claimed to have accomplished anything remarkable. If strangers had met her at the grocery store, they would have described her exactly the same way everyone else did. Kind, quiet, respectful. The woman who always smiled first. The woman who remembered everyone's birthday. The woman who somehow made every person around her feel welcome. She was known for baking pies every Thanksgiving. Neighbors often stopped by asking if she could repair a torn coat or shorten a pair of pants. She never charged anyone. She simply enjoyed helping. As a child, I thought everyone had a mother like mine. Only much later did I understand how unusual she truly was. She possessed a calmness that couldn't be taught. Nothing ever seemed to shake her. Not financial struggles. Not broken appliances. Not harsh winters. Not even the difficult years after my father passed away. While other people panicked, she quietly found solutions. She believed every problem became smaller if you refused to let fear make the decisions. Whenever I became upset, she'd hand me something to fix. Sometimes it was an old radio. Sometimes a loose cabinet hinge. Sometimes simply a shirt missing a button. She'd smile and say, "Busy hands give frightened minds somewhere else to go." At the time, I thought it was just another one of her sayings. Years later, I discovered she had spent her entire life following that advice herself. She was always sewing. Morning, afternoon, late at night. The soft rhythm of thread pulling through fabric became part of the soundtrack of my childhood. If I woke during the night because of a thunderstorm, I'd often find a light still glowing beneath her bedroom door. She would be sitting in her old rocking chair, reading glasses balanced near the end of her nose, needle moving carefully through worn fabric, the sewing box resting beside her feet. Sometimes she wasn't repairing anything at all. She simply opened the box, looked inside, sat quietly for several minutes, then closed it again. As a little boy, I found that strangely comforting. I assumed adults simply did mysterious things that children weren't supposed to understand. I never questioned it. Not after the promise. That promise changed something inside me. It didn't make me curious. Oddly enough, it made me avoid the box completely. Children usually want forbidden things. I became the opposite. Whenever my mother asked me to hand her scissors, I'd carry the entire sewing basket without looking inside. If she left the lid open while answering the telephone, I'd look away. It became almost automatic, as though breaking my promise could happen simply by accident. Years passed. Middle school became high school. The old farmhouse slowly changed. Wallpaper faded. Furniture grew older. The kitchen floor developed little squeaks that everyone in the family learned to step around. But one thing never moved. The sewing box remained beside her favorite chair. Always within reach. Always closed. Always protected. Friends who visited our house barely noticed it. To them, it was just another old object. To me, it had quietly become the center of an unanswered question. Not because I wanted to know what was inside, but because I couldn't understand why my mother seemed to need it so close every single day. Sometimes I'd catch her resting one hand gently on the lid while watching television. Not opening it. Not touching the sewing supplies. Simply resting her hand there. almost as though she was reassuring herself that something precious hadn't disappeared. Once, when I was about 16, I asked the closest thing I'd ever asked about it. "Mom." She looked up from her knitting. "Yes." "How long have you had that sewing box?" She smiled. "Oh, a very long time." "Did Grandma give it to you?" For just a fraction of a second, something changed in her expression. Not fear. Not exactly sadness. More like someone unexpectedly hearing an old song they hadn't thought about in years. She answered carefully, "No. Someone else did." Before I could ask another question, she stood up and began preparing dinner. Conversation over. At 16, I accepted that answer. At 42, I would remember every single word, especially those two. Someone else. The final autumn I spent with my mother didn't feel important while I was living through it. That's one of life's cruelest habits. It rarely tells us when we're experiencing something for the last time. The last breakfast. The last Sunday afternoon. The last birthday. The last conversation that seems completely ordinary until years later, when you would give almost anything just to hear those words one more time. I had recently started college. It was only 2 hours away from home, but it felt like another world. My visits became shorter. Classes, part-time work, new friends, and endless responsibilities slowly filled every empty space in my calendar. Whenever I apologized for not coming home more often, my mother would simply smile. "You should be building your own life." She never made me feel guilty. Never complained. Never asked me to stay longer. Instead, she always packed enough homemade food for an entire week. Jars of soup. Fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Apple pie carefully covered with aluminum foil. Even after I moved into a tiny apartment after graduation, those care packages never stopped. Every Sunday afternoon, without fail, she'd hand me another paper bag full of food before I drove away. She never said, "I love you." She didn't need to. Love arrived in glass jars and homemade bread. During those years, I noticed something changing about her. Not dramatically. Just little things. She climbed the porch steps more slowly. Her hands trembled slightly whenever she threaded a needle. Sometimes she'd pause in the middle of sewing and massage her wrists before continuing. When I asked if she was feeling all right, she'd always answer exactly the same way. "I'm getting older, that's all." I believed her. Children have a strange habit. Even after becoming adults, we still imagine our parents are somehow permanent. We notice wrinkles, gray hair, slower footsteps. But deep inside, we still believe they'll always be there waiting whenever we decide to come home. One Saturday in late October, I arrived unexpectedly. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside carrying groceries. "Mom." No answer. The house was unusually quiet. I found her sitting on the back porch, wrapped in her favorite knitted blanket. She wasn't sewing. The sewing box rested beside her chair, closed. She was simply watching leaves drift across the yard. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We just watched the wind. Finally, she smiled. "I used to think autumn was sad." "What changed?" She looked toward the old maple tree. "I realized trees aren't dying. They're simply letting go of what they no longer need." I laughed softly. "You always make everything sound poetic." She shrugged. "Maybe life already is." That afternoon became one of my favorite memories. We talked for hours. About childhood. About neighbors who had moved away. About recipes I'd never bothered learning. About my father. She told funny stories I'd never heard before. Stories about his terrible dancing. His terrible singing. His habit of pretending he could fix things before secretly calling someone else. She laughed until tears formed in her eyes. It was one of the happiest days we'd shared in years. Not once, not a single time, did she mention being sick. Not once did she tell me that doctors had already begun running tests. She carried that burden alone. Months later, I learned she had known far more than she ever admitted. Looking back, there were clues. The unopened medication bottles. The increasing number of hospital appointments, she insisted, were routine. The way she'd sometimes stop halfway up the stairs just to catch her breath. I noticed every one of those things. I simply chose the explanation that frightened me the least. One evening before I drove back home, she walked me to my car. The air was cold enough that our breath formed little clouds between us. She hugged me longer than usual. Then she quietly said, "Whatever happens, don't let regret become heavier than love." I smiled, assuming she was simply sharing another piece of motherly wisdom. "I won't." She nodded. "I know." Then, almost absent-mindedly, she glanced through the living room window, toward the chair, toward the old sewing box resting exactly where it had always been. At the time, I thought she was making sure she'd remembered to lock the house. Today, I believe she was saying goodbye to something else entirely, and I had no idea that it would be the last autumn we would ever spend together. My mother passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. Even now, after all these years, I can't hear gentle rain against a window without thinking of that day. The hospital called just before sunrise. I already knew why the phone was ringing. For weeks, the doctors had spoken in careful sentences. They never said there was no hope. They simply stopped talking about recovery. By the time I reached the hospital, the room was quiet. Too quiet. The machines had already been turned off. The nurses spoke softly, almost whispering, as though raising their voices might somehow disturb her sleep. She looked peaceful. More peaceful than she had looked in months. I stood beside her bed for what felt like hours. I wanted to say something meaningful. Something worthy of being the last conversation between a mother and her son. Instead, I thanked her for everything. For every packed lunch, every repaired shirt, every birthday cake, every lesson she had taught without ever realizing she was teaching. I kissed her forehead. It was colder than I expected. That was the moment reality finally reached me. The funeral took place 3 days later. Nearly the entire town attended. People I barely recognized approached me with stories I'd never heard before. An elderly man told me my mother had secretly paid his heating bill one winter. A young woman explained that my mother had repaired her wedding dress free of charge after a last-minute accident. Another neighbor confessed that my mother had delivered groceries to his wife every week during her battle with cancer. I listened in silence. Each story revealed another piece of a woman I thought I already knew. It seemed everyone had received some quiet act of kindness from her. Everyone. Except me. Not because she loved me less, but because children rarely see the full lives their parents live outside the home. After the funeral, everyone slowly returned to their own routines. The flowers wilted. The sympathy cards stopped arriving. Phone calls became less frequent. Life continued. Mine didn't. For several weeks, I drove to the farmhouse almost every evening after work. I wasn't accomplishing anything. Sometimes I'd wash dishes that were already clean. Sometimes I'd sweep floors that didn't need sweeping. Sometimes I'd simply sit in silence. The house no longer felt empty. It felt paused, as though she had stepped outside for a moment and would return carrying groceries at any minute. Her glasses still rested beside her favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle remained folded on the coffee table. One of her knitting projects still hung over the armrest exactly where she'd left it. And beside that chair, the sewing box, closed, waiting. For the first few visits, I deliberately avoided looking at it. Every time my eyes wandered toward that corner of the room, I immediately looked somewhere else. The promise echoed inside my mind with surprising strength. No matter what happens to me, never open this box. She had trusted me. That trust suddenly felt heavier than grief itself. Several relatives offered to help clear the house. I thanked them and politely refused. "I'll do it." The truth was, I wasn't ready. Packing someone's belongings feels strangely final. As long as their clothes still hung in the closet. As long as their favorite mug remained in the kitchen cabinet. As long as their slippers still waited beside the bed. Part of your heart can continue pretending they might return. Weeks became months. Months became nearly a year. The farmhouse remained almost untouched. Dust slowly settled across every surface. But one thing never changed. Whenever I locked the front door before leaving, my eyes always landed on the sewing box, still resting beside her chair, still exactly where she'd left it, still unopened. And every single time, without even thinking, I quietly whispered the same words to myself. I promised. Then I'd turn off the lights, lock the door, and leave the secret sleeping for another year. People often imagine promises as something active, something you think about every day, something you constantly struggle to keep. Mine wasn't like that. My promise slowly became part of who I was. It stopped feeling like a decision. It became instinct. The years moved faster than I ever expected. I got married, bought a small house across town, changed jobs twice, watched friends become parents, then watched their children graduate high school. Life never pauses long enough for grief to stay in the center of the room. It quietly moves into a corner, not because we forget, but because life insists on making space for new responsibilities. Still, every few months, I drove back to the farmhouse. I mowed the lawn, cleaned the gutters, opened the windows to let fresh air circulate through the old rooms. The neighbors probably assumed I was preparing to move back someday. I wasn't. I simply couldn't let the house disappear. It was the last place where my mother's laughter still seemed to exist. The smell inside never completely changed. Old wood, fresh linen, cinnamon, lavender. Even after decades, the house somehow continued smelling like her. Sometimes I'd find myself speaking out loud. Not conversations, just little comments. The roof held up well this winter. I finally fixed that loose porch step. I planted new roses. It probably sounds foolish, but in those quiet rooms, it almost felt as though she was still listening. One afternoon, nearly 15 years after her passing, I finally decided to organize the attic. Dust floated through the sunlight pouring in from the tiny round window. Cardboard boxes lined every wall. Old Christmas decorations. My father's fishing equipment. School notebooks. Stacks of faded family photographs. Hour after hour, I sorted memories into neat piles. Keep, donate, throw away. Then, hidden beneath an old blanket, I noticed something familiar. Another sewing basket. Smaller. Much older. Its leather handle had almost completely fallen apart. For a brief second, my heart raced. Could this be the one? Had I remembered wrong all these years? I slowly opened it. Inside, nothing. Just rusted needles. Several wooden spools. Tiny scraps of faded fabric. No letters. No photographs. No hidden compartment. Just sewing supplies. I actually laughed at myself. It reminded me how deeply that promise had settled inside me. Even after 15 years, simply seeing an old sewing box was enough to make my pulse quicken. I carefully closed the lid, placed it back exactly where I had found it, then continued cleaning. The real sewing box remained downstairs, beside her chair, untouched. Another decade passed. Technology changed everything. Cell phones became smartphones. Photo albums became cloud storage. Letters disappeared from mailboxes. Children stopped learning cursive handwriting. Entire neighborhoods transformed. But every time I stepped into that farmhouse, time refused to move. The grandfather clock still ticked. The floorboards still creaked beneath the hallway. The afternoon sunlight still entered through the same kitchen window. And beside the old chair, the sewing box waited. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at it for several seconds. Not with curiosity, with respect. I had begun wondering if the contents even mattered anymore. Perhaps the promise itself had become more important than whatever lay inside. Maybe that was exactly what my mother had intended. Maybe keeping my word was the true inheritance she wanted to leave me. That thought comforted me. Until everything changed. It happened during my 42nd year. A letter arrived from an attorney. The farmhouse could no longer remain empty. The property taxes had increased. Major structural repairs were now unavoidable. Keeping the house had become financially impossible. For the first time in 30 years, I had to prepare the house to be sold. And that meant every single room, every single closet, every single drawer would finally have to be emptied, including the corner of the living room, where one old wooden sewing box had been patiently waiting for me all along. I postponed the decision for almost 6 months. Every excuse seemed reasonable. The weather wasn't good enough. Work had become too busy. The contractor hadn't called back. The market might improve next spring. Deep down, I knew none of those reasons were true. I simply wasn't ready to let go of the last place where my mother's presence still felt real. But houses don't wait forever. Wood begins to rot. Pipes leak. Roofs sag beneath one too many winters. Eventually, memories become expensive. One Friday afternoon, I met with a real estate agent named Susan. She walked slowly through every room carrying a small notebook. She measured windows, examined the hardwood floors, checked the plumbing. Occasionally, she stopped to make quick notes. The entire process felt strangely uncomfortable. She wasn't being disrespectful. She was simply doing her job. But every sentence felt like someone assigning a price to pieces of my childhood. The kitchen will need updating. The wallpaper should probably come down. The bathroom could use renovations. I nodded politely. Inside, it felt as though someone was criticizing my mother herself. Susan eventually stepped into the living room. She smiled warmly. "This room has wonderful natural light." Then her eyes drifted toward my mother's old rocking chair. The chair still stood exactly where it had always been. Beside it, the sewing box. Susan pointed toward it. "Family heirloom." I looked at the box for several long seconds before answering. "I think so." "You think?" I smiled awkwardly. My mother never really talked about it. Susan laughed. "My grandmother had one almost exactly like that. They're becoming collectible now." Then she casually added, "You'll probably want to go through it before the estate sale." I froze. Go through it? She had spoken the words so naturally, as though opening it were the most obvious thing in the world. She had no way of knowing those 6 simple words collided with a promise that had survived 3 decades. "I won't be selling it." She looked surprised. "Oh, personal reasons?" "Yes." She nodded respectfully and changed the subject. But the damage had already been done. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. "You'll probably want to go through it." That evening, after Susan left, I stayed in the house alone. The sun slowly disappeared behind the old maple trees outside. Golden light stretched across the living room floor. Dust floated through the air like tiny stars. I sat in my mother's rocking chair for the first time in years. It creaked exactly the way it always had. The sewing box rested beside me, within arm's reach. For several minutes, I simply looked at it. 30 years. 30 years of walking past it. 30 years of refusing to touch the latch. 30 years without even wondering if curiosity might someday win. Until now. Because selling the house meant strangers would soon walk through these rooms. Contractors, painters, movers. Eventually, a completely different family. What if someone else opened it? What if the estate company emptied it without asking? What if everything inside ended up in a cardboard box marked miscellaneous at some auction? For the first time, keeping my promise no longer seemed simple. My mother had told me never to open the box. But she had never imagined strangers handling her belongings decades later. Or had she? I stood up, walked to the front window, then back again. My eyes kept returning to the same place. The small brass latch, worn smooth after decades of use. I reached toward it, stopped, pulled my hand away, walked into the kitchen, made coffee, came back, sat down again. The house was completely silent except for the grandfather clock. Tick, tick, tick. Every sound seemed louder than usual, almost as though the house itself was waiting. I rested both hands on my knees, closed my eyes, and for the first time in 30 years, I asked myself a question I had avoided my entire adult life. Was keeping a promise more important than understanding why it had been made? I opened my eyes. The sewing box sat exactly where it always had. Quiet, patient, almost inviting. I took one slow breath, reached toward the worn brass latch once more, and this time, I didn't pull my hand back. For a long moment, my fingertips rested on the brass latch without applying any pressure. I expected to feel excitement, curiosity, perhaps even fear. Instead, I felt guilt, the kind of guilt that settles deep inside your chest. Not because someone is watching, but because someone once trusted you. Outside, the wind gently brushed against the windows. The old maple tree scraped its branches across the roof exactly the way it had throughout my childhood. Everything felt strangely familiar, almost as though time had folded back on itself. I looked toward my mother's empty rocking chair. For just a second, I could almost imagine her sitting there, knitting quietly, pretending not to notice what I was about to do. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The words escaped before I even realized I had spoken them. "I'm so sorry." Slowly, I lifted the latch. It made a soft metallic click, a sound so ordinary, yet one I had never heard before. I waited. Nothing happened. No dramatic revelation. No hidden mechanism. Just silence. I carefully lifted the lid. The familiar scent of cedar drifted into the room. It smelled exactly like my mother's sewing corner. Inside, everything appeared completely ordinary. Small spools of thread, needles arranged inside a faded pin cushion shaped like a tomato, tiny silver scissors, a measuring tape with numbers nearly rubbed away, several spare buttons sorted into little glass jars, an old thimble, pieces of folded fabric. For several moments, I simply stared. 30 years. For this, I almost laughed at myself. Perhaps my mother had simply wanted one private possession. Perhaps there had never been any mystery at all. Maybe I had spent decades imagining secrets where none existed. I gently picked up the pin cushion. Nothing. I examined the jars of buttons. Ordinary. The scissors. The measuring tape. Everything looked exactly as it should. Relief slowly replaced disappointment. Maybe keeping my promise had mattered more than the contents after all. I began placing each item back exactly where I had found it. Then, something caught my attention. The inside bottom of the box looked slightly uneven. At first, I assumed the wood had warped with age. But when I pressed lightly near one corner, it moved. Only a fraction of an inch. I froze. My heartbeat became painfully loud inside the quiet room. I removed every remaining sewing supply and carefully set them on the table. Now the wooden base was fully visible. Running my fingers along the edges, I discovered an almost invisible groove, so perfectly crafted that it disappeared beneath decades of scratches. Someone had built a false bottom. Very carefully, very intentionally. I hesitated. If I stopped now, technically, I had already broken the promise. But whatever my mother had wanted hidden was still hidden. My hands trembled as I slipped a fingernail beneath the tiny groove. The panel resisted. Then, with a gentle pop, it lifted. Beneath it rested a small bundle wrapped in yellowed linen. No jewelry, no money, no family fortune. Just one carefully folded package. It couldn't have been more than an inch thick. I picked it up. It felt surprisingly light. The fabric had been tied with a faded blue ribbon. One knot. Simple. Deliberate. I untied it slowly. Inside lay several envelopes. Every one of them had been carefully sealed. Every one of them had yellowed with age. Across the top envelope, written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, were just 7 words. For my son. Only if you finally opened this. My throat tightened. She had known. Somehow, she had known that one day, I would break my promise. Not because I wanted to, but because life itself would eventually leave me no other choice. I stared at the envelope for what felt like forever. My mother had been speaking to me, across 30 years of silence, and whatever waited inside that first letter had been waiting just as patiently, for several minutes. I couldn't bring myself to open the envelope. I had already crossed one line. Breaking the seal somehow felt like crossing another. My mother's handwriting looked exactly as I remembered it. Elegant, patient, every letter perfectly formed, as though she believed words deserved as much care as people. I gently traced my finger across the faded ink. For my son, only if you finally opened this. Not if you disobeyed me. Not if you broke your promise. She had chosen the word finally, almost as though she had always expected this day to come. I slowly opened the envelope. The paper inside crackled softly with age. It wasn't a long letter, only a single page, but every sentence felt heavier than the one before. My dearest Michael, if you are reading this, it means life became more complicated than promises. If that happened, I forgive you. My eyes immediately filled with tears. 30 years. I had carried guilt for something she had already forgiven before it even happened. I kept reading. I never wanted you to spend your life wondering what was inside this box. I wanted you to spend your life learning that some promises are meant to protect people, not objects. I stopped. Read the sentence again. Protect people, not objects. What did that mean? The next lines only deepened the mystery. The sewing box was never important. What it hides is. I turned the page over. Nothing. That was the entire letter. No explanation. No answers. Only more questions. Beneath it rested another envelope. This one looked older. Much older. Its paper had darkened with time. Unlike the first letter, this one wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to my mother. Across the front, in handwriting I had never seen before, someone had written only 2 words. To Eleanor. My mother's name. My pulse quickened. The envelope had already been opened decades earlier. Very carefully. I hesitated. Reading my mother's private correspondence felt deeply intrusive. Then I remembered something. She had hidden these letters beneath a false bottom. She had addressed the first one specifically to me. She had known I would find the others. She wanted me to read them. Otherwise, she would have burned them long ago. With trembling hands, I unfolded the second letter. The paper was brittle enough that I worried it might tear. The signature at the bottom caught my attention before anything else. It wasn't my father's name. My heart skipped. The signature simply read, Thomas. Thomas. I searched my memory. No uncle. No cousin. No family friend. No one by that name had ever been mentioned during my childhood. I started reading from the beginning. My dear Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I've already gone where I always feared I would. Gone. The letter continued. I've accepted that history will remember some people and completely erase others. If that happens to me, promise you'll never tell him. Tell him. Tell who? Me. The words seemed almost impossible to process. My breathing became shallow. Every sentence raised another question. Another missing piece. Then I reached one line that made the room seem to disappear around me. He deserves a peaceful childhood, even if it means he grows up believing another man was his father. I stopped breathing. Read it again. Then again. Another man was his father. My hands began shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the letter. There had to be another explanation. Surely I was misunderstanding. Surely him referred to someone else. Not me. It couldn't mean my father. The man who had raised me. The man I buried when I was 21. The man whose photograph still sat on my living room bookshelf. I looked down at the signature once more. Thomas. A man whose name I had never heard. A man my mother had somehow erased from every conversation. A man who now seemed connected to the biggest secret of my entire life. And suddenly, the sewing box no longer felt like an old family keepsake. It felt like the doorway to a past my mother had spent 30 years trying to keep buried. I don't remember how long I sat there staring at that single sentence. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe half an hour. Time had stopped making sense. The living room had grown darker. The last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the maple trees, leaving only the soft glow of a single lamp beside my mother's chair. I wasn't reading anymore. I was remembering. My father's laugh. The smell of motor oil on his work shirts. Saturday mornings spent fixing bicycles together in the garage. The fishing trips where we caught almost nothing but somehow came home smiling every time. The Christmas morning he surprised me with my first baseball glove. The night he stayed awake beside my bed because I had pneumonia. Those memories weren't fake. They couldn't be. No letter could erase 30 years of love. No stranger named Thomas could simply appear and rewrite my childhood. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. No. The word escaped my mouth almost instinctively. No. There had to be another explanation. Perhaps Thomas had been writing about another child. Perhaps my mother had been helping someone else. Perhaps I had misunderstood the context completely. I reached for the remaining envelopes. There were 6 of them. Each one tied together with the same faded blue ribbon. Each one carefully preserved. One carried only a date. April 17th, 1963. Another had no writing at all. One envelope was noticeably thicker than the others. Another felt as though it contained photographs. I resisted the urge to open them all at once. Instead, I returned to Thomas's letter. This time I forced myself to read every word slowly, without jumping ahead, without allowing panic to fill in the missing pieces. He wrote about fear, about mistakes, about believing that sometimes loving someone meant disappearing from their life. Again and again he referred to my mother with extraordinary tenderness. Not dramatic romance, not passion. Something quieter, deeper. The kind of affection built through years rather than moments. Then one sentence caught my attention. I'll always be grateful to William. William. That was my father's name. My stomach tightened. The letter continued. He is a better man than I ever managed to become. I blinked, confused. If William knew Thomas, then this wasn't some secret affair discovered after my father's death. They knew each other. Possibly well. I kept reading. Tell him that one day, if the truth ever becomes necessary, he has my blessing to tell our son everything. Our son. There it was again. This time impossible to misunderstand. The room suddenly felt too small. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. My hands needed something to do. I filled a glass with water. Took one sip. Set it down untouched. Every object inside that house suddenly seemed unfamiliar. The family photographs hanging in the hallway. My parents smiling beside their old pickup truck. Vacation pictures at the lake. Birthday celebrations. Graduation day. How many of those smiles had been carrying this secret? Had my father known every single day? Or had he discovered it later? Questions multiplied faster than answers. I returned to the living room. My mother's rocking chair creaked softly as I sat back down. For the first time since opening the sewing box, I looked directly at my father's framed photograph on the bookshelf. He smiled exactly as I remembered him. Warm, gentle, completely ordinary. The man who taught me to shave. The man who cried at my wedding. The man whose funeral I had mourned with every part of my heart. Whatever these letters revealed, nothing could take those memories away. Family wasn't built by blood alone. I knew that. My mother had taught me that lesson long before I understood it. Still, one question refused to leave my mind. If William wasn't my biological father, then why had he stayed? Most men would have walked away. Most men would have left. Mine hadn't. He had chosen me. Every single day. Suddenly, The mystery inside the sewing box no longer belonged only to my mother. It belonged to him too. And somewhere among the remaining unopened envelopes, I began to suspect my father had finally written his own part of the story. I stared at the remaining envelopes for several minutes. Until then, everything I had learned came through two voices, my mother's and Thomas's. There was still one voice missing, the man who had raised me, the man I had called Dad for 42 years. If he had known the truth, surely he had left something behind. Carefully, I picked up the thickest envelope. It wasn't addressed to anyone. There was no date, no name, only 3 words written in handwriting I recognized immediately. If necessary. My heart began pounding. It wasn't my mother's handwriting. It wasn't Thomas's. It was my father's. I had seen those letters thousands of times growing up. On birthday cards. On little notes left beside my lunch. On Christmas presents. He had always written my name with the exact same looping M. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside, there were 4 folded pages. The paper was newer than the others, probably written years after the first letters. I unfolded the first page. My dear son, if you are reading this, then your mother is no longer here to decide whether this conversation should happen herself. I immediately felt tears forming. Even after his death, he was still protecting her, not himself. Her. I kept reading. There are many ways for a man to become a father. Only one of them requires blood. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, I couldn't continue. Somehow, before saying anything else, he had already answered the question I had been afraid to ask. When I finally gathered the courage to continue, his words became even more personal. I knew the truth before you were born. Not after. Not years later. Before I was even born. He had known from the beginning. I kept reading as my hands trembled. Your mother told me everything. Every detail. Before she agreed to marry me. I couldn't believe what I was reading. There had never been deception. Never a hidden betrayal. My father had entered that marriage knowing exactly whose child I was. He had chosen it. Deliberately. Freely. The next paragraph explained why. She offered to leave. She believed I deserved another chance to build a different life. Instead, I asked her one question. The letter paused there, almost as though he wanted me to hear his voice. The question wasn't, "Who is the father?" The question was, "Who needs us most right now?" I felt something inside me break. Not from pain. From understanding. My father hadn't fallen in love with a perfect situation. He had fallen in love with a frightened young woman carrying a burden she believed would ruin every future she could have. And instead of walking away, he stayed. The next sentence nearly made me cry. I never rescued your mother. We rescued each other. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. The same gentle sound I remembered from the day we buried him. I continued reading. The day you were born, the nurse placed you in my arms before anyone else. You wrapped your tiny hand around my finger. From that moment forward, nothing else mattered. He admitted there had been difficult moments. Not because of me. Because people talked. Small towns always do. Rumors spread. Questions followed. Some relatives whispered. Others judged. But every single time, he made exactly the same choice. To remain. To love. To protect. Then I reached the final paragraph on the second page. If one day you learn that another man gave you life, please remember, life and fatherhood are not the same gift. I lowered the pages into my lap. My vision blurred. All those years, I had admired my father because I believed he had simply been a good man. Now, I realized I had only known half the story. He wasn't simply a good man. He had quietly carried one of the greatest acts of love I had ever witnessed. And he had done it without ever asking for recognition. Without telling anyone. Without expecting gratitude. For more than 40 years, he had allowed history to remember him only as that, exactly the title he had always wanted. I didn't sleep that night. The old farmhouse had become impossibly quiet. Rain continued falling long after midnight, tapping gently against the windows like distant fingers asking to be let inside. I remained in my mother's rocking chair. My father's letter rested neatly folded beside me. For the first time since opening the sewing box, I no longer felt angry, confused, yes, overwhelmed. Absolutely. But angry? No. Because the more I read, the less this story felt like betrayal. It felt like sacrifice. 3 people, each carrying the same secret for a different reason. My mother, my father, and the mysterious man named Thomas. There was only one way forward. I picked up the next envelope. This one was older than my father's letter. The paper had become almost fragile. Across the front, my mother's handwriting read only one sentence. The last letter he ever sent. I took a slow breath before opening it. Inside were 3 pages. Thomas's handwriting appeared steadier this time. Less hurried. More peaceful. My dear Eleanor, by the time this reaches you, I'll probably be living several states away. Perhaps that's for the best. Some people spend their lives trying to return home. I've spent mine trying to stop looking back. I continued reading. He explained that leaving had never been punishment. It had been his decision. One he believed would protect everyone. Then, halfway through the second page, the truth finally began revealing itself. My greatest mistake wasn't loving you. My greatest mistake was believing I had enough time. Enough time. I kept reading. Thomas described being drafted into military service. His deployment had arrived unexpectedly. He believed he would return within a year. Instead, everything changed. Months became years. Letters stopped arriving regularly. Communication became unreliable. He admitted something that immediately made my heart ache. I kept asking myself to write one more letter. Tomorrow. Next week. After things became safer. Tomorrow became years. I closed my eyes. How many lives had been changed by one delayed letter? By one postponed conversation? Then came the sentence that explained everything. When I finally came home, you were already married, and I thanked God you were. I read it again. Not bitterness. Not resentment. Gratitude. He wasn't angry that my mother had built another life. He was relieved. He continued. I watched William from a distance before I ever met him. I saw the way he looked at you. The way he carried the groceries so you wouldn't have to. The way he smiled at the little boy standing beside him. The little boy. Me. Thomas had seen me. My hands began trembling. He had watched us. Not secretly. Not obsessively. Simply making sure we were all right. I knew then that the child no longer needed another father. He already had one. A tear landed on the paper. I quickly wiped it away before the ink could blur. The final page contained no dramatic confession. No request to meet. No desperate plea for forgiveness. Only acceptance. I hope one day he grows into a kind man. Not because he carries my blood. Because William will teach him how. I couldn't stop crying. 4 years. I had imagined Thomas as someone who had abandoned us. Someone selfish. Someone careless. Instead, I had discovered a man who believed love sometimes meant stepping aside forever. The final paragraph consisted of only 4 short sentences. If fate is kind, tell him I loved him. If fate isn't, don't burden him with my memory. Let him keep his father. He deserves that. I slowly folded the letter. Silence filled the room again. 3 people. 3 extraordinary acts of love. My mother had protected me. My father had chosen me. And Thomas had let me go. Not because he didn't love me. Because he loved me enough to believe another man could give me a better life. When I finished reading Thomas's final letter, I thought the mystery had ended. I believed I finally understood my family's secret. I was wrong. As I carefully returned the letter to its envelope, I noticed something lying beneath the stack. It wasn't another letter. It was a small paper sleeve, the kind photographers used decades ago to protect printed pictures. Its edges had become soft with age. Across the front, my mother had written only 4 words. Only after the letters. Not before. After. As though she had wanted me to understand the story before seeing the faces. My hands trembled as I slid the photograph from its sleeve. It was black and white. Slightly faded. The corners were worn from being held many times. 3 people stood in front of a small country church. The first face I recognized immediately. My mother. She couldn't have been older than 22. She was smiling. But not at the camera. She was looking toward someone standing beside her. The second face belonged to my father. Much younger than I had ever known him. His hair was darker. His shoulders broader. He wore the same gentle smile I remembered from childhood. Then, I looked at the third man. Thomas. For the first time in my life, I was looking directly into the face of the man whose blood flowed through my veins. I expected something dramatic. Some impossible resemblance. Instead, I simply saw a stranger. His eyes looked kind. His smile seemed shy. He stood beside my father with one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Not rivals. Not enemies. Friends. Real friends. I turned the photograph over. More handwriting. This time, it belonged to my father. If Michael ever sees this, I hope he notices what matters. That was all. No explanation. Just one sentence. I looked back at the photograph. At first, I noticed nothing unusual. 3 young adults. One ordinary summer afternoon. Then, my eyes drifted downward. Their hands. My father and Thomas were both wearing work gloves tucked into their belts. Their boots were covered with mud. Behind them, half of the church roof was missing. Construction materials surrounded the building. They hadn't gathered there for a celebration. They had been rebuilding the church together. Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't a photograph of rivals competing for the same woman. It was a photograph of 2 men working side by side. 2 men who had somehow found enough grace to choose compassion over resentment. I studied Thomas's face more carefully. There were tiny similarities. The shape of his eyebrows. The line of his jaw. Maybe my nose. But they were small things. The features people notice only after someone points them out. The man I truly recognized was still my father. Not because we looked alike. Because every expression on my own face, every habit, every value, every lesson that had shaped my life, had come from him. Blood had introduced me to the world. Love had raised me inside it. For the first time, those 2 truths no longer felt like they were fighting each other. They simply existed together. I slipped the photograph back into its sleeve. As I did, something unexpectedly fell onto my lap. A tiny brass key, no larger than the key to an old diary. Attached to it, a brittle paper tag. My mother's handwriting appeared one final time. This belongs to the safety deposit box. The bank knows the rest. I stared at the key in complete silence. The sewing box hadn't held one secret. It had been leading me, one careful step at a time, toward another. I barely slept. The little brass key remained on the kitchen table all night. Every time I walked past it, I found myself stopping, staring, wondering how many years my mother had carried that tiny piece of metal in silence. A safety deposit box. The words echoed through my mind until sunrise. I had never heard my parents mention renting one. Not once. By 8:30 the following morning, I was standing outside the same local bank my parents had used for decades. Very little had changed. The brick building looked almost identical. The brass handles on the front doors had been polished so many times they reflected the morning sun. Even the large oak tree in the parking lot was still there. Inside, the scent of paper, polished wood, and old carpeting instantly reminded me of visiting the bank with my mother as a child. An elderly woman greeted me from behind the reception desk. Her silver name tag read, Margaret. She smiled politely. How may I help you today? I placed the tiny brass key on the counter. I believe this belongs to a safety deposit box. She adjusted her glasses. Her expression changed almost immediately. May I ask your mother's name? Eleanor Carter. For a brief second, Margaret simply looked at me, almost as though she recognized the name. I remember your mother. Those words caught me completely off guard. You do. She nodded gently. She came here every year, always on the same day. My heart skipped. Every year. For almost 30 years. 30 years. Even after hiding the letters. My mother had continued visiting the bank every single year. Margaret excused herself and disappeared into a back office. When she returned, she wasn't alone. The branch manager accompanied her. He carried a thin leather folder. Mr. Carter. Yes. He offered a sympathetic smile. I'm very sorry for your loss. I thanked him quietly. He opened the folder. Your mother left detailed instructions. Detailed instructions. Those words immediately reminded me of the envelopes inside the sewing box. Everything she had done, everything had been planned. The manager continued. According to her instructions, the contents of the safety deposit box were not to be released until after the sewing box had been opened. I froze. He couldn't possibly know about the sewing box. Yet, there it was, written inside official bank documents. My mother had connected the two. She wanted one discovery to happen before the other. Exactly in that order. The manager looked at me kindly. I assume you've already completed that step. After a long silence, I nodded. Yes. He smiled softly. Then it's time. He led me through a heavy steel door, past several security gates, into a quiet underground vault lined with hundreds of identical metal boxes. The room felt almost sacred, cold, silent, timeless. He unlocked one side of the deposit box, handed me the tiny brass key. The second lock is yours. My fingers trembled as I inserted it. The mechanism clicked effortlessly. Together, the two locks released. The manager carefully removed the narrow metal drawer, placed it inside a private viewing room, then quietly closed the door behind him. For several seconds, I simply stared. One small metal box. 30 years of waiting. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there was no cash, no jewelry, no deeds, no hidden fortune. Instead, I found a neatly organized collection of ordinary things. A leather journal, several sealed envelopes, a small velvet pouch, and a VHS cassette. I blinked. A videotape. Across its faded label, written in my mother's handwriting, were 7 simple words. If you're watching this, I'm already gone. My breath caught. A video. My mother had left me. Her voice. Her face. Not through memory. Not through photographs. She had recorded one final conversation. 30 years ago. Knowing, one day, I would finally be ready to hear it. I carried the metal box home with extraordinary care. Not because it contained valuables. Because, for the first time in 30 years, it contained something far more precious. The possibility of hearing my mother's voice again. Back at the farmhouse, I placed everything carefully on the dining room table. The journal, the velvet pouch, the envelopes, and the VHS cassette. There was only one problem. I no longer owned a VCR. Like most people, I had thrown mine away years earlier. For a moment, I actually laughed. After waiting 30 years, one outdated piece of technology stood between me and my mother's final words. The following morning, I drove across town searching for someone who still repaired old electronics. After several phone calls, I found a small shop run by an elderly man named Harold. The shelves were filled with radios, cassette players, record players, and televisions from decades past. It felt less like a repair shop, and more like a museum. When I showed him the tape, he smiled. "Haven't seen one of these in a while. Do you still have a VCR?" "I've got 3. He connected one to an old television sitting in the corner, then looked at me. "Want to watch it here?" I hesitated. "No. I think this one belongs at home." He nodded immediately. "I understand." He lent me the player for the weekend. By late afternoon, I had everything connected in my mother's living room. The television sat exactly where it always had. The rocking chair remained beside it. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I chose to sit in my father's old armchair instead. It somehow felt right. My hands shook as I inserted the tape. The machine pulled it inside with a soft mechanical sound. Static filled the screen. Several seconds passed. Then, the image appeared. It was grainy, slightly faded, but unmistakable. My mother. She was sitting exactly where I remembered. In her rocking chair. The sewing box rested on her lap. She looked directly into the camera. Then, she smiled. Not the polite smile she gave strangers. Not the tired smile she wore during her illness. Her real smile. The one I hadn't seen in decades. Before she spoke, I was already crying. "Hello, sweetheart." Her voice. Older than I remembered. Softer, but undeniably hers. "If you're watching this, then you finally ignored me." She laughed gently. I laughed too. Through tears. "I suppose that means I failed to keep my promise. Or perhaps you finally understood why I asked for it." She paused. Her expression became thoughtful. "When you were little, I worried that if you learned the truth too soon, you might spend your childhood looking for someone who wasn't there. I couldn't allow that. You already had everything a child truly needs." She looked slightly away from the camera, toward someone standing behind it. I realized. My father had probably been recording. She smiled in his direction before continuing. "William never replaced anyone. He never competed with anyone. He simply loved you. He loved you before you took your first breath." Tears rolled freely down my face. My mother continued speaking calmly. "I know you've read the letters by now. I also know you've probably spent hours wondering whether we made the right decision." She leaned slightly forward. "Only you can answer that. But if I could live my life again, I would choose exactly the same father for you." She wasn't talking about Thomas. She was talking about William. My father. Then she reached down, placed one hand gently on top of the sewing box, and spoke the sentence that would stay with me forever. "Blood begins a story. Love finishes it." Silence followed. She wiped one small tear from her cheek, then smiled once more. "If you've reached this moment, I've already been gone a long time. So let me ask one last favor. Don't spend the rest of your life searching for what you lost. Spend it protecting what you still have." She looked directly into the camera one final time. "I've loved you every day of your life. Now, it's time for you to live the rest of yours." The screen faded to static. The tape ended. The room became completely silent. I remained sitting there for nearly an hour. Not because I still had questions. For the first time, I finally had peace. The VHS tape changed something inside me. Not because it answered every question. Because it reminded me that some answers don't erase pain. They simply make it easier to carry. For a long time, I remained seated in silence. The television screen had already gone black. The VCR continued making its soft mechanical hum. Outside, the evening sun cast long golden shadows across the living room floor, exactly as it had on thousands of ordinary afternoons during my childhood. Eventually, my attention returned to the remaining items from the safety deposit box. The leather journal. It was small enough to fit comfortably in one hand. Dark brown. Its edges had become smooth with age. Unlike the letters, it wasn't sealed. My mother had expected me to read it. The first page contained only a date. January 8th, 1964. Below it, one sentence. Asterisk, today I decided that if my son ever learns the truth, he deserves to know mine too. Asterisk. I slowly turned the page. The journal wasn't written every day. Some entries were separated by weeks, others by months. It wasn't a diary. It was more like a conversation she hoped we might someday have. One entry immediately caught my attention. Asterisk, everyone believes courage looks loud. Asterisk. Asterisk, they imagine speeches, impossible sacrifices, dramatic moments. Asterisk. Asterisk, they're wrong. Asterisk. Asterisk, most courage happens quietly. Asterisk. Asterisk, sometimes courage is simply waking up and choosing kindness again. Asterisk. I smiled. That sounded exactly like my mother. Another page described the day she discovered she was pregnant. Not with shame, not with fear, but with overwhelming uncertainty. Asterisk, I wasn't afraid of raising a child. Asterisk. Asterisk, I was afraid of raising one inside a world that judges before it understands. Asterisk. She admitted there had been nights she considered leaving town forever, starting over somewhere nobody knew her. Then came another passage. Asterisk, William asked me something no one else did. Asterisk. Asterisk, he didn't ask what had happened. Asterisk. Asterisk, he asked what I needed. Asterisk. I closed my eyes. Even now, my father continued surprising me. She wrote that she fell in love with him twice. The first time, when he chose to stay. The second, when he promised never to make me feel different. She described the day I took my first steps, the day I started school, the day I broke my arm falling out of the apple tree. Every memory centered around one person. Not Thomas. William. Every night before bed. Asterisk, he checked to see if Michael had kicked off his blanket. Asterisk. Asterisk, he always tucked him back in before going to sleep himself. Asterisk. I laughed through fresh tears. I remembered pretending to stay asleep. I remembered feeling the blanket pulled gently over my shoulders. I had always assumed it was my mother. Apparently, it often wasn't. Then I reached an entry written only months before my father's death. The handwriting had become slightly less steady. Asterisk, sometimes I worry he'll discover the truth after we're both gone. Asterisk, if that happens. Asterisk, I hope he never wastes 1 minute wondering whether William loved him. Asterisk. She underlined the next sentence. Asterisk, there has never been a father in this world who loved a son more completely. Asterisk. I rested my hand against the page. The room felt impossibly still. Everything I had believed was changing. Yet somehow, the foundation beneath my life wasn't collapsing. It was becoming stronger. The journal continued for several more pages. Recipes. Small family memories. Advice she never found the right moment to say aloud. One sentence made me smile more than all the others. Asterisk. Don't sell the rocking chair. Asterisk. Asterisk. Someone in the family should always have a comfortable place to forgive people. Asterisk. I laughed softly. Only my mother could connect forgiveness to an old wooden chair. Then, tucked inside the final page, I found one last folded note, smaller than all the others, written in different handwriting. Not hers. Not my father's. Thomas's. He had written only one sentence. If he ever wishes to know where I spent the rest of my life. Asterisk. The answer is inside the velvet pouch. Asterisk. For several seconds, I simply looked at the velvet pouch. It was the only item from the safety deposit box I hadn't touched. Somehow, it felt different. The letters had given me memories. The journal had given me understanding. But Thomas's final note suggested this small pouch contained something else. An ending. Or perhaps, a beginning. The dark blue velvet had faded almost to gray. The drawstring was worn smooth from years of careful handling. My mother must have opened it countless times. Yet somehow, She had always tied it closed again. I loosened the string, turned the pouch upside down. A single object slid gently into my hand. Not jewelry, not money. A brass compass. It was beautifully made, heavy for its size. Its glass face had tiny scratches from decades of use. Inside the lid, someone had engraved 6 words. Asterisk, so you'll always find home. Asterisk. I smiled without realizing it. Then I noticed something folded beneath the compass. A tiny piece of paper, barely larger than a business card, written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Blue Ridge, Virginia. Below the town's name. An address. Nothing more. No explanation. No request. No plea to visit. Just an address. I turned the paper over. On the back, one final sentence. Asterisk. Only if your heart is ready. Asterisk. I leaned back in the chair. Blue Ridge. Nearly 600 miles away. I had never been there. Never even heard my parents mention it. Was Thomas buried there? Had he built another family? Was anyone still alive who remembered him? Questions filled my mind. But something unexpected happened. For the first time since opening the sewing box, I didn't feel urgency. Months earlier, I would have jumped into my car immediately, driven through the night searching for answers. No, I wasn't sure, because I finally understood something my parents had known all along. Some truths heal, others simply satisfy curiosity. Those aren't always the same thing. I carried the compass to the living room window. The needle settled quietly toward north. Steady, certain. It occurred to me that my entire life had been exactly like that compass. I had always known where home was, not because of blood, because of love. The address wasn't inviting me to discover who I was. I already knew that. It was simply offering me the chance to understand one more chapter of someone else's life. I slipped the paper back into the pouch, then picked up the compass once more. The engraving caught the evening light. Asterisk. So you'll always find home. Asterisk. Suddenly, I realized the words weren't written for Thomas, or for my mother. They were written for me. Home had never been a place. It had never been a farmhouse, or a town, or even a family name. Home had always been the people who chose to love me, and no discovery could ever change that. I didn't leave for Virginia the next day, or the next week. In fact, nearly 2 months passed before I made the decision. Not because I was afraid, because I wanted to be certain my reasons were honest. I asked myself the same question over and over again. Was I searching for another father? The answer was no. I already had one. Was I hoping to fill some empty space inside myself? Again, no. That space no longer existed. My mother had filled it with truth. My father had filled it with love. Thomas had filled it with peace. So why go? Eventually, the answer arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning while I was making coffee. Not to find someone. To say thank you. Not in person. Not even aloud. Simply, thank you. Thank you for making the hardest decision of your life. Thank you for trusting another man to become the father I needed. Thank you for never asking me to choose between you. 3 days later, I packed a small overnight bag, placed the brass compass inside the glove compartment, folded the address carefully into my wallet, and began driving north. The journey took nearly 10 hours. Highways slowly gave way to country roads. Cities became rolling hills. The landscape reminded me strangely of my childhood. Old wooden fences, weathered barns, fields stretching toward distant mountains. Everything felt peaceful, almost familiar. Late that afternoon, I finally reached the small town. Blue Ridge. It was exactly the kind of place where people still greeted strangers. A single main street, one diner, a hardware store, a post office, an old church with white wooden siding. Nothing about it suggested extraordinary stories had ever happened there. Perhaps that's why extraordinary stories survive best in places like this. I parked near the address. My heart immediately slowed. It wasn't a house. It was a small cemetery. Quiet. Beautifully maintained. Tall oak trees shaded nearly every pathway. Wind moved gently through the branches overhead. Birdsong filled the afternoon air. I looked again at the paper. The address was correct. Slowly, I walked through the iron gate. The compass remained in my jacket pocket. Not because I needed directions. Because somehow, it felt like bringing everyone with me. Near the back of the cemetery stood a modest granite headstone. Simple. Unpretentious. Exactly the kind of monument I imagined Thomas would have chosen. The inscription read, Thomas Everett, 1939, 2004. Beloved friend. Beloved son. No mention of husband. No mention of father. Just, beloved friend. Someone had placed fresh wildflowers beside the stone only a few days earlier. Someone still remembered him. I stood there quietly, not speaking, not crying, just breathing. Eventually, I knelt beside the grave. I don't know if people can hear us. I smiled softly. But if they can. Thank you. The wind stirred gently through the trees. For one brief moment, it almost sounded like someone exhaling after carrying something heavy for a very long time. I placed my hand lightly against the cool granite. You kept your promise. And my father kept his. My mother kept hers. I think it's my turn now. Before leaving, I reached into my pocket, removed the brass compass, held it in my palm for several seconds. Then, I placed it gently against the headstone. Not as a gift, as a goodbye. After a quiet moment, I picked it up again, because home was still waiting for me. When I returned from Virginia, the farmhouse didn't feel the same. For years, I had believed it was a place filled with unanswered questions. Now, it felt like a place that had quietly kept every answer until I was finally ready to receive them. I unlocked the front door just before sunset. The familiar creak greeted me once again. For the first time in decades, the silence no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. I walked slowly through every room. The kitchen, the hallway, my old bedroom, the back porch where my mother and I had watched autumn leaves dance across the yard. Every corner carried memories, but they no longer carried unfinished conversations. I found myself smiling instead of grieving. That surprised me. Grief had lived inside this house for 30 years. Now, it seemed to have quietly packed its own bags. I sat in my mother's rocking chair one final time. The chair rocked gently beneath me, exactly as it always had. Beside it, the sewing box remained open. Its hidden compartment no longer held secrets, only empty space. I carefully placed every letter back inside. My mother's journal, Thomas's letters, my father's letter, the photograph. Every page returned to the place where they had patiently waited for 3 decades. Then, I closed the false bottom, placed the sewing supplies back exactly as my mother had left them. The measuring tape, the scissors, the thread, the little tomato-shaped pin cushion. Finally, I closed the lid. The soft click of the brass latch echoed through the quiet room. This time, it wasn't closing a mystery. It was protecting a story. One day, perhaps someone else in the family would open it again. Not because they needed answers, because they deserved to know what love sometimes looks like. It doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it looks like a man choosing another man's child. Sometimes, it looks like a young woman carrying impossible guilt with quiet dignity. Sometimes, it looks like a father stepping away because another father can offer a better life. Those kinds of stories rarely appear in history books, but they shape families for generations. I stood up and looked around the room. There was one final task left: selling the house. 4 months. That decision had felt like betrayal. Now, it felt like gratitude. Homes aren't meant to become museums. They're meant to continue collecting laughter. New birthdays. New Christmas mornings. New children running through old hallways. My mother understood that long before I did. She had never wanted me to preserve the building. She wanted me to preserve the love that had lived inside it. The two things were never the same. A month later, the papers were signed. The farmhouse officially belonged to a young couple expecting their first child. As I handed them the keys, the wife looked toward the old rocking chair. "I love that chair." I smiled. So did my mother. She asked if it came with the house. I looked at it for several seconds, then nodded. "Yes, it belongs here." As I walked toward my car, I turned around one last time. The young couple stood together on the porch, laughing, planning, dreaming, exactly as families should. For the first time, watching strangers enter my childhood home didn't break my heart. It healed it, because homes, like love, were never meant to be locked away forever. People often ask whether discovering the truth changed my life. The honest answer is, yes, but not in the way most people imagine. It didn't change my last name. It didn't change my childhood. It didn't change the man who taught me to ride a bicycle, or the man who stood proudly beside me on my wedding day. It changed something much quieter. It changed the way I define family. For years, I believed family was something we inherited. Now, I know family is something we choose. Every single day. A father chooses. A mother chooses. Children eventually choose too. The older I become, the more I understand my parents. Not because they were perfect. They weren't. They made impossible decisions with incomplete information. They carried fear, regret, hope, just like the rest of us. The difference is, they never allowed those fears to become stronger than love. My mother's sewing box now sits in my own home. Not in a place of honor. Not locked away inside a cabinet. It rests on a simple wooden shelf beside a family photograph. Sometimes visitors notice it. Most don't. If someone asks about it, I simply smile. It's been in my family for a long time. That's true. They don't need the entire story. Some stories belong to everyone. Others belong only to the people who live them. Every autumn, when the leaves begin falling, I think about that afternoon on the back porch. My mother watching the trees. The trees aren't dying. They're letting go of what they no longer need. For years, I believed she was talking about autumn. Now I know. She was talking about herself. She spent her entire life slowly preparing to let go. Not of me. Of the burden she'd carried for decades. She trusted that one day, I'd be strong enough to carry the truth without letting it become resentment. She was right. I still visit my father's grave several times a year. I always bring fresh flowers. Sometimes I tell him about my life. Sometimes I sit there in complete silence. Before leaving, I always say the same words. "Thank you, Dad." Because that's exactly who he was. And always will be. As for Thomas, I visit him too. Not as a son searching for a father. As one man thanking another. Two different relationships. Both real. Both deserving of peace. The sewing box taught me something I wish everyone could learn before it's too late. The greatest inheritance parents leave behind isn't money, or property, or family heirlooms. It's the way they teach us to love after they're gone. If you're fortunate, you'll inherit a house. If you're very fortunate, you'll inherit wisdom. But if you're truly blessed, you'll inherit people whose love continues guiding you long after their voices have fallen silent. And if that ever happens, hold on to it, because some promises aren't made to keep us from discovering the truth. They're made to ensure we're finally ready when the truth discovers us.